She was 18 years old on a Tuesday in March, when her mother's husband changed the Wi-Fi password and left a cardboard box of her things on the porch. The box held her clothes, her tin whistle, the one photograph she had of her father, and a charging cable that wasn't hers. Her mother did not come out. Niamh stood on the porch steps with the box and looked through the kitchen window, and her mother was standing at the sink with her back turned. And that was the last thing she saw clearly before she picked up the box and walked down the driveway to the road. She was not going to cry, or she was going to cry later, and she was choosing when. She had $83 in her back pocket, and a listing she had looked at on her phone twice in the past week without quite knowing why. And she had the length of the valley road to decide whether she was going to be the kind of person who made something from almost nothing, which she suspected was the only option available to her. So the deciding was mostly already done. The listing was for a sheepfold and 6 acres on the benchland above the Blackfoot River, 15 miles west of Ovando in Powell County, Montana. No building. The listing said, just the fault. A lean-to and tack room in good repair, a spring that had never been surveyed but appeared reliable, and 6 acres of native grass. The county had held it since the estate of the last registered owner had cleared in 1987 without a buyer for this parcel. Available at $1. She called the Powell County Assessor's office from the payphone outside the Ovando General Store. There were still 2 payphones in Ovando, and she had always liked this about Ovando. The assessor, a woman named Ruth Decker, said yes, the property was available, and that the dollar price reflected its character as a working fold rather than a residential property, and that there was no structure suitable for habitation, and that buyers should understand this before proceeding. Niamh said she understood. She drove to the assessor's office in the truck she'd bought for $400 from a man at the feed store in Lincoln the previous summer. A 1994 Ford that ran reliably, except when it didn't. And she put $1 on Ruth Decker's desk and got the deed. If you're new here, I'd love it if you subscribed. And please leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Niamh Boland had grown up in the Blackfoot Valley, which is the kind of place that either marks you for life or sends you away as fast as you can go, and she was the kind of person it marked. Her father, whose name was Sen, had come from Galway City in the west of Ireland in his late 20s, had worked for a year in Missoula, and had then driven north into the valley one September afternoon, and had apparently decided that the mountains above the river looked sufficiently like certain parts of Connemara from the right angle that he would stay. He had stayed for 12 years, long enough to marry Niamh's mother Colleen, and to become a fixture at the Ovando Saloon's occasional music nights, where he played traditional Irish music on a battered BC button accordion and a tenor banjo with 2 strings that were not entirely correct. He had left when Niamh was 12, gone back to Galway for reasons that were not precisely explained to Niamh at the time, and that she had stopped needing to be explained after a while, because some things that are not explained to a 12-year-old simply become facts rather than mysteries over time. He had left behind one thing that was genuinely his, a cassette tape recording of himself playing traditional music at a session in Missoula in 1999, which someone had made and given him, and which Niamh had found in a box of her mother's things when she was 14, and had kept without mentioning it to anyone. The tape was of a man she barely knew playing music she didn't know yet, and she had listened to it until it wore thin, which was faster than you'd think for a cassette tape, and then she had ordered a tin whistle from the internet for $12, and taught herself to play from YouTube videos, moving toward something she wasn't sure she was allowed to be moving toward. Her mother's marriage to Dale Frisch had started 2 years after Niamh's father left, and had proceeded in the way of second marriages that are determined to succeed, with the energy of 2 people who need it to work, and who have decided that needing it badly enough is sufficient to make it so. Dale ran a small equipment repair business out of a shop on the edge of Lincoln, and he was competent and predictable, and he made her mother laugh in a way Naiv had not seen her mother laugh since her father left. And Naiv had understood this to be a good thing, and had tried to act accordingly. Dale was not a bad man. He was a man who had clear ideas about how a household should function, and who had not anticipated a teenager who was not his, and who had managed this by becoming increasingly specific in his requirements for the household, and increasingly opaque in his displeasure when those requirements were not met. And this was visible to Niev, and apparently not quite to her mother, who had a way of being present for what she wanted to be present for. Her mother had managed the tension by deciding, repeatedly, that Niam was fine, that Niam was resilient, that Niam was old enough, practically 18, would be starting her own life soon. These were all true statements arranged to function as a justification for not doing anything, which is a particular kind of dishonesty that is very hard to argue with because every individual element of it is accurate. Niev had not argued with it. She had watched her mother choose, in increments small enough to be deniable, and she had understood what was happening, and she had also understood that understanding it was not the same as being able to stop it. On the morning she turned 18, the incremental choosing was finished. Her mother stood at the kitchen sink with her back turned and did not come out. She was not angry in the corrosive way. She was clear-eyed. There was a difference. The Sheepfold was above the river bench, on a track that was marked on the county map as a road, and on the ground as a determined pair of tire ruts through the sage. She drove up in the Ford on the afternoon she got the deed, with the cardboard box of her things in the truck bed, and the mountains came into view around the last curve in the track, the way they always came into view in this part of Montana, which was as if someone had moved a screen aside to reveal that the whole world was larger than you had thought. The Mission Range on the western horizon, white-peaked still in March. The valley floor below, brown and tan, with the river in it somewhere invisible from here. Above the fold on the slope, the remains of an old fence line running up into the timber. The fold itself was a dry stone enclosure, perhaps 60 feet by 40, built with a local limestone that came out of the hillside in flat, stackable slabs the color of old bone, the walls about 4 feet high and solid, 2 feet thick in most places, built by someone who understood that a wall in this climate and this wind had to be able to deal with both, without requiring anyone to think about it. The joints were good. She ran her hand along the inside face of the south wall and felt how well the stones sat against each other, how little movement there was in what looked like irregular stacking, but was in fact very deliberate placement. Somebody had known what they were doing, and they had done it for the benefit of sheep, which she thought said something about the person. The lean-to was at the east end, built into the wall, roofed with cedar shakes that were old, but had not yet failed. It smelled inside of lanolin and old hay, the smell of sheep in a place that holds the memory of sheep even when none are present. The tack room was a wooden addition off the lean-to, dry inside, with a workbench along the north wall and a row of iron hooks for hanging equipment, 3 of them still holding old halters in leather so dried it was nearly rigid. A small wood stove in the corner appeared, when she opened the flue and put her hand to the draft, to draw correctly. She put the cardboard box of her things on the workbench. She put the tin whistle on top of the box. She looked at the fold through the tack room door, and at the mountains through the fold, and at the sky above the mountains, which in March in Montana is a very specific blue, cold and high, and with the particular clarity of a sky that has been cleaned by a season of snow. At the center of the fold, occupying the position that made sense for a feeding station, accessible from all sides, not too close to the walls where the sheep would crowd, was the stone. A single piece of limestone, flat-topped, roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide and 2 feet thick, sitting on 3 smaller stones at a height of about 18 inches. It was the kind of stone that had been placed with intention, not fallen, not tumbled, but set. She put her hand on it the first afternoon, It was cold from the March air, and it had a specific solidity. The solidity of something very heavy that has not moved in a very long time. She slept in the tack room the first week, on a sleeping bag on the workbench, with the wood stove going and the door propped open enough to give her the view of the fold and the mountains beyond. She had done outdoor work in the valley since she was 15. She knew what a propane stove was for. She knew how to fell and split wood. She knew which end of a shovel to use and how long you could use it before your back told you to stop. She was not. She was clear about this, a person who had been done any favors by the situation. She was a person who was proceeding. On the fourth day, she tried to move the feeding stone. She wanted it at the edge of the fold, rather than the center, to give herself more working space, and she had a pry bar from the tack room and an understanding of leverage from watching her father move large rocks in the yard when she was a child, which was one of the few memories she had of him doing domestic things. She worked the pry bar under the edge of the stone and applied weight, and it moved, shifted, grated on its supports, and as it shifted, the space beneath it became visible. The dry cavity between the stone and the ground was about a foot deep and several feet across, sealed from rain by the stone's overhang and from moisture by the limestone base. In the cavity was a bundle, wrapped in what she took at first for old canvas, but which was something softer, something with a different texture. A piece of material that was the color of pale wood and had been folded around the bundle with care. She set the pry bar down. She reached into the cavity. She drew the bundle out. If you're still with me, please subscribe if you haven't already. Stay. Donnell Echevarria put these papers under this stone in 1947, and what he left there had been waiting for someone to find them for 76 years. She brought the bundle to the tack room workbench, and she unwrapped it carefully, because the outer material was something she didn't want to damage. It was a piece of tanned hide, not rawhide, but finished leather, soft and pale, the kind of thing made by hand rather than commercially processed. It had been folded around the bundle and tied with a length of braided rawhide cord that was stiff but intact. When she opened it, the papers inside were dry and legible, and there were many of them, loose sheets of varying sizes, held together by the hide, and they were covered in handwriting. Dense, careful handwriting, small letters, the lines close set, and the language was not English. She could read the occasional word of Spanish from 4 years of high school Spanish, and this was not Spanish. It was something else. The letters were recognizable as the Latin alphabet, but the words were like nothing she had encountered. She put them down without being able to read them, and she looked at them for a moment, and then she picked up the last sheet, which was set apart from the others and written in larger, cleaner letters, and at the bottom of this sheet, in English it said, "These songs are for the hills. Leave them if you go, take them if you must, but play them." D. Echevarria, 1947. She held the sheet in her hand. She looked out the tack room door at the fold in the mountains. She said, to no one in particular, "All right then." She drove to the Ovando General Store the next morning and asked at the counter whether anyone knew what language the word Echevarria was from. The man behind the counter, who was named Gary and had been running the store for 22 years, looked at the name she had written on a piece of paper and said, "Basque." He said it the way people say something they know from context rather than from study. The Blackfoot Valley had been sheep country for a long time, and Basque herders had worked these ranges since before Gary's grandfather's time, and the name had that sound. He said there was a man in Ovando named Iker Mendizabal, whose grandfather had run sheep on this side of the valley in the 30s and 40s, and who might know more. Iker Mendizabal was 76 years old and had been born in Boise, but had lived in the valley for 50 years. And he came to the Sheepfold on a Tuesday in April, driving a newer truck than hers, and wearing the clothes of a man who had spent a lifetime outdoors, and dressed accordingly, without making anything of it. He looked at the fold for a long time before he came through the gate, and then he walked around the inside of the enclosure slowly, touching the wall at intervals, and he came to the feeding stone and he put both hands on it. He did not say anything for a while. "My grandfather told me about this fold," he said finally. "About a man named Daniel who kept it, who would let the other herders stop here when they were moving their flocks." He looked at the lean-to. He said Daniel used to sing, that you could hear him at night when the flock was settled, singing in Euskara. The other men didn't understand the words, but they liked the sound of it. They said it kept the sheep calm. He looked at the space where the feeding stone had been before she moved it, because she had moved it to the edge of the fold as intended, and the cavity was still visible. "He left something here?" She showed him the papers. He sat at the tack room workbench, and he went through them slowly, reading. His Euskara was not fluent. His grandfather's generation had spoken it, but the language had not been fully passed on, and reading it was slower than speaking it had been for them. But he could make out enough. He said, "These are songs. These are the songs he sang." He held one of the sheets up to the light from the tack room window. "This one. I've heard this one. My grandfather used to sing it. I didn't know the words were written down anywhere." Dr. Priya Sathyan was a musicologist at the University of Montana in Missoula who had spent a decade researching what she described as the disappearing music of Western American pastoral cultures, and who drove to the Sheepfold on a May morning in a car that was clearly not designed for the track, and which she drove with a kind of determined focus that Naya respected. She spent 2 hours with the papers. She was meticulous and quiet while she worked, making notes in her own hand, occasionally asking Naya a question about the context of the find. At the end of the 2 hours, she sat back on the tack room stool and she said, "I need you to understand what you have here." She said it in the tone of someone who has learned that the way you deliver news of this kind matters. She said that written examples of the Basque pastoral songs, the herding songs, the work songs, the night songs that the Basque shepherds had sung on American ranges from Nevada to Montana were extremely rare. That the tradition was oral, that it had been transmitted person to person, and had therefore been vulnerable to disappearance when the herding culture itself changed. That she had found fragments before, scattered references, a partial transcription here and there, but nothing like this. 25 songs with lyrics and partial melodic notation by a single herder, covering what appeared to be a span of years from the early 1930s to 1947. She said the Basque Cultural Center in Boise had been trying to document this tradition for 30 years, and that this collection would be the most significant addition to that documentation they had received. She said this carefully and without overstatement. Then she said, "Do you play music?" Niamh thought about her tin whistle in the cardboard box on the workbench in the corner. She said, "Some." She had started trying to work out the melodies 2 weeks before Priya came, in the evenings after the tack room stove had warmed the space enough that her hands were loose. She had the whistle and one of the sheets that had enough notation to give her something to start from. 5 notes. A rough indication of interval. Not a full score, but a skeleton. The Basque musical scales were not the same as the Irish scales she'd been learning from YouTube tutorials, but they had something in common that she felt before she could name it. A modal quality. A sound that sat between major and minor in a way that was not a compromise between them, but something older than either. The sound of a musical tradition that had been working out its own logic for a very long time without needing to be the same as any other tradition. She played a phrase. She corrected. She played it again. She played it a 3rd time and something resolved. Not perfectly. She was still feeling for it. but enough. And the sound that came out of the tin whistle in the small stone room under the Montana sky was something she had not quite expected, which was that it fit. It fit the space and the air and the mountains visible through the tack room door, and the fold outside, and the 6 acres, and the spring, the way a thing fits when it was made for where it is. Her father had played in a Missoula session in 1999. He had decided one September afternoon that Montana mountains looked enough like Connemara from a certain angle to stay. She had taught herself his music from a cassette tape until it wore thin, and then she had kept going without the tape. She did not know how good she was. She knew she could hear the songs, which was a different and more specific skill, and which the songs in the Hyde bundle seemed to respond to, as if they had been waiting for someone with ears for this particular kind of thing. Iker came back in June, and they sat at the tack room workbench, and she played him the melody she had worked out for the song he had said his grandfather sang. She played it badly at first, correcting as she went, and then she played it again more steadily, and Iker was quiet while she played, and quiet for a moment afterward. Then he said his grandfather used to hum it when he was doing the evening count, making sure all the sheep were in. He said he hadn't heard it since he was a boy. He said it was exactly right. She told him about Daniel's practice of letting other herders stop at the fold. He said he knew this, that his grandfather had stopped there, more than once, coming through with a flock. He said it had been known on the range as a safe place, that Daniel kept dry wood and a fire ring, and that the spring was reliable, and that no one was turned away. He said Daniel had been a particular kind of man, not a talker, but someone who thought about other people in a particular sustained way, the way some people think about weather. He looked at the enclosure. He said, "This is still good grazing land." She had already been thinking about this. She put a notice on the feed store board in Ovando, Sheepfold spring open to drovers. Fire ring and dry wood available. No charge. She didn't know if anyone still moved flocks through this part of the valley on foot or horseback. She put the notice up anyway, because some things deserve to be available even when the need for them is uncertain. Iker helped her clear the old fire ring and restack it with creek stone, and she filled the lean-to south end with split wood from the timber above the fold. Enough for a season. In July, a man came through with 4 horses and asked if the spring was really open, and she said yes, and he camped 2 nights in the fold and left without much conversation, which was fine. In September, 2 young women moving a small flock of Icelandic sheep along the valley road came up the track after seeing the notice and stayed one night. They had a small camp stove and their own food, but they used the fire ring anyway, and in the morning, one of them played a fiddle for an hour at the fold gate, and the sound went up into the mountain air, the way sound goes in high, clear places, which is very far. The Basque Cultural Center's story ran in the Missoula paper in August and was picked up by a music news website that Nayav had not heard of, and by 2 Montana radio stations, and briefly by a site that covered folk music internationally. Her mother saw it shared on Facebook by a woman they had both known in Ovando, and she texted Nayav. The text said, "I saw this. I'm proud of you. Are you okay?" Nayav read it. She put her phone down. She picked it up 2 days later, on a morning when the mountains were visible in exceptional clarity, the kind of morning in Montana when the air has been washed clean by rain and everything appears at its full distance and full size, and the sense of scale is something a person has to simply accept. She typed, "I'm good, Mom." She sent it. She put the phone in her pocket and went to check the water level in the spring trough. She did not forgive her mother that day. She did not need to forgive her mother that day. She left a door open the width of 3 words, and that was enough for now, and she went to check the spring. In October, she bought 2 Rambouillets from a rancher named Donna, 6 miles down the valley, because they were a fair price, and because the land needed something on it, and because there was a specific quality of rightness about sheep on this ground that she had understood since the first morning she walked into the fold and smelled the lanolin in the old lean-to. She did not know much about sheep. She was learning. Donna came over twice in November and stood in the fold and told her things while the ewes grazed the dried grass along the south wall, and Niev wrote what Donna said in a notebook she kept on the tack room workbench, next to the photocopies of Danelle's songs that Priya had left with her, the originals now in conservation storage at the university, but the copies hers, on the bench where she could reach them in the evenings. She played the songs on the whistle most evenings, working through them one by one, finding the melodies by feel and by the partial notation, and by something she didn't have a word for but which had to do with being in the fold in the evenings when the light came off the mountains at a low angle and the ewes were settled, and the air had the particular quality it had. Here, which was very still and very clear and very large. The songs were for this. She understood this now, not in a mystical way but in a practical way, the way you understand that a tool fits its purpose when you use it in the place it was made for. Danelle had written them in this fold, under this sky. She was playing them in this fold, under this sky. The hills had not changed much. The Basque Cultural Center in Boise held a heritage festival in November. Priya had arranged for Niev to be there as the finder and custodian of the Etsesabaria collection, which was to be formally donated to the center's archive. Iker drove with her because he knew Boise and because he wanted to come, which she had not asked for, but was glad of. She had never been to Boise. She had never been to a Basque festival. She had never played her tin whistle for anyone except alone in the tack room, and for Iker that one evening in June. They asked her if she would play. She said she would try. They gave her a microphone stand she didn't need, and she moved it aside and stood at the front of the low stage with the whistle. And the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is about to begin, that the people in it have reasons to pay attention to. She played the song Iker's grandfather had sung at the evening count, the one she had worked out first, 3 months ago, in the tack room, badly and then more steadily, until she knew it the way you know a thing that has moved from your head into your hands and no longer requires the head to manage it. The melody was not long. None of the herding songs were long, Priya had explained, because they were working songs, meant to be repeated, meant to be variable, meant to fill the time between and around the work without needing to announce themselves as music. She played it through once. She played it through again. Someone in the room made a sound that was not a word. An older woman near the front had her eyes closed. Iker, standing at the side of the room, was looking at the floor the way people look at the floor when they are trying to hold something together. She played it a third time, and then she stopped. Because 3 times was right. It felt right. And the room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that people needed to hear. She was 18 years old. She was in a sheepfold in Montana at 18. Which was not the plan anyone had had for her. Not her mother, not Dale, probably not herself. If she had been asked in February what March was going to look like. But she had the fold and the 6 acres and the spring and the ewes and the songs and the tin whistle and the Montana sky, and she had learned something in the months between March and November that she had not known in February, which was that ground was the first thing. Not family, not approval, not a clear path forward, ground, something under your feet that was yours and that would still be there in the morning. Everything else you could work out from ground. She had found that the songs were for the hills, and the hills were for the songs, and she was apparently for both of them, which she had not planned, and which she was not going to argue with. Donald Etsebaria had written them in this fold and left them under the feeding stone with the instruction that they be played. And they had waited 76 years for someone to find them, and the person who found them happened to play Tin Whistle, which seemed to Naiv like exactly the kind of coincidence that isn't. Play them. She had. She would keep going. If this story found you today, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs it, and please subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave me a comment. Has music ever carried something for you that words couldn't? I read every word you write. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.